Okay, y'all. For today, I wanted to take you through a few graphs and show you a couple of things to illuminate better how consumers interact with the macroeconomy, or at least what type of things may influence how consumers interact with the macroeconomy. So the textbook focuses a lot on the more aggregate expenditures model approach to understanding what's going on, and I want to today discuss at least a little bit about how income and credit can also influence how these consumers behave and their propensity to save versus consume. So first thing I want to do was update you on one of the graphs from the textbook. You have here a Federal Reserve economic data graph that's showing real disposable personal income versus real personal consumption expenditures. And this is an update to one of the graphs in the textbook, and I just wanted to show that the relationship continues as the textbook emphasizes. There is a very strong relationship between disposable personal income and the level of personal consumption in the economy. The textbook starts out with this to make the case that the reason why we care at all about per disposable personal income is because it is a good predictor of consumption expenditures. Now, your textbook shows you this as a time series that is just like levels of personal income versus personal expenditures each year. Actually, let me make sure this is on an annual basis. I'm going to show you one of the things that we kind of do in economics to check to see if things actually do have a strong relationship is to look at them on a percentage change basis. So while it's good to see that both of these lines are moving up at the same time, this may be largely influenced by what we call in econometrics a unit root, which in simple terms means that both series may be driven by a variable that they share together that is probably the movement of time. In that, as time moves along, we just see income and expenditures both grow at the same time. But this doesn't tell us much about whether the two influence each other because time has that relationship with a lot of variables. There are a lot of variables in economics that actually grow over time. So what we want to do is see, instead of looking at something as the frequency is not the frequency, I'm sorry, instead of looking at the units as billions of change 2012 dollars, we want to look at them actually as a percentage change from a year ago. I think it'll only do this for one of the variables right now. Yep, so I'm going to do this to both variables. I'm going to change this one also to percentage change from a year ago. And now this makes an even stronger case that real disposable income is very closely related to personal consumption expenditures. As you can see, the magnitude of the changes is usually very similar between the two, and the direction of the changes are very similar between the two. So when I say magnitude, I mean that when, for example, in 1974, disposable personal income falls by 1.1%, you see personal consumption expenditures fall by 0.83%. That's a very similar magnitude. At the same time, for example, I'm looking for a good place to point this to. So let's use 1992. When real disposable income grows by 4.1%, you see personal consumption expenditures grow by 3.6%. This is a very tight relationship. And while the relationship seems to be a little bit more like, ooh, in the later years since the turn of the century, really, there's still some strength in the directionality, as in when one goes down, when personal income goes down, so does the personal consumption. Okay, so let me change these back. Actually, it really doesn't matter if I change them back or not. All right, so now that I've shown you this update, let me take you to one of the things that we consider or should think about when we talk about income, and that is occupations and earnings. So let me reload this website so that we can check it out. The Hamilton Project, which is affiliated with the Brookings Institute, a bipartisan think tank, or maybe better described as a nonpartisan think tank, produced an interactive called Where Work Pays, Occupations and Earnings Across the United States. Now, when we think about the influences of income on expenditures or consumption, we should think about it from or from multiple aspects, really. One of those aspects should be that we automatically consider disposable income. So we want to consider income after adjusting for taxes. Now, looking at this map, which is going to show us income delineations based around occupations, but also for certain geographies, we want to automatically, and ages, by the way, we want to automatically adjust this for our income taxes so that we know about disposable income. And what you're already seeing is that for all occupations on all ages, there are definitely some parts of the income distribution or some parts of the country where median earnings are far higher than they are in other areas. And you can see that by the depth of color for each of these regions, right? So what you're looking at right now, let me see if I can zoom out a bit so we can see a bit more about the New York region. The New York metro area, median earnings are typically around $36,000. That is, so what we're looking at are what is typically considered a metropolitan statistical area, an MSA. So it's not just considering the city, but also the economically affiliated areas around a city. In this case, for New York, that encapsulates some of Newark, Jersey City, and even some parts of Pennsylvania. And I think perhaps even some parts of Connecticut, but don't quote me on that right now. But what I wanted to point out is that this region here is very high in median earnings compared to the rest of the country. And you can see that as you move further away from the sea or further away from the coastline, the median earnings tend to fall. Metropolitan areas are really the places that attract not only opportunity, but also the workers who command higher wages. And that's why you see that in many of the metro areas, we're looking at San Francisco right now. If we look a little bit further south, we would see San Diego's. Trying to find the LA area. But you get the picture here. If we just go along this coastline, you can see that the major financial centers, these major cities are where incomes become very high. But part of that is also driven by the fact that people have to pay a lot to live in these areas. So let's also adjust this for cost of living, just so we get a more balanced picture of where incomes are high. And now you can see the picture is a little bit more balanced. Once you adjust for the cost of living in New York, its median earnings actually come a lot more in line with what's going on with the rest of the country. There are parts a little bit east of New York that attract higher incomes even after accounting for the cost of living. And, it's no coincidence that this is also in Connecticut, where honestly, a lot of the hedge fund owners who operate their hedge funds out of New York live in Connecticut. But yeah, this pattern still holds true in many of the coastal areas, where even though they are still a little bit cheaper, well, paying less in median wages after you account for the cost of living, they're still paying relatively high amounts compared to the rest of the country. So we already know now that cost of living can make a difference in the consumption power for a household, which implies that the consumption power of households is going to vary across the country. It's going to vary by geography. Let's also think about occupation, though. So, for example, we saw the median earnings for all occupations, but what if I was, for example, to put in economist? So economists, market researchers, and survey researchers, what do their median earnings look like? What you can see is that there's not that much data available in certain parts of the country, probably because people just are not demanding economists in some parts of this country. Some of these places probably demand very specialized economists, so maybe economists in agriculture. Maybe their city centers hire a few economists who work on public finance, but largely these areas are not really in the business of hiring economists. But you can see where they are in demand, they are paid pretty well compared to other regions. So New York, again, high cost of living, kind of makes this whole thing mute, but you can see again along the coast of Connecticut, there are some darker purples there indicating some higher median earnings. You can see the same thing around the San Francisco area, which makes sense because, of course, there's a lot of business activity there as well as one of the Fed's central banks. And you can see the same thing around the Chicago area. Again, similar reason, business activity, Fed central bank. And oh, look, Atlanta. Again, like the places where there's a lot of financial activity happening is where you're going to see demand for economists. But I also want you to appreciate that in many of these places, the median earnings for economists are above what's being offered just in general for people in that economy or that area, which gives us an idea that your consumption also depends upon your occupation. And finally, you can see that it also depends upon your age. So if we were to even just take economists and only look at economists who are making, or I'm sorry, only look at economists who are between the ages of 25 and 34, they're making, I mean, on average less everywhere, but the top of the median earning spectrum is closer to around the 44,000 range. And you're seeing that mostly in Pittsburgh with 46,000 as median earnings there. Let me see, also going on in Austin, 44,000. What if we were to look at economists a little bit more, a little bit deeper in their careers? Maybe an economist close to the middle age. Their median earnings are in the 64,000 range. And the places where they're earning that are a little different too, right? So Houston in this case now, and more so Seattle. Probably again indicative of, especially in Seattle, that's pivoting for firms like Amazon towards the use of economists for a lot of their analyses. And when we go like closer to like late stages of careers, you can see again earnings are much higher, and they're higher in certain regions as well, where the data is more available. You see the DC region is a lot more towards the higher part of the spectrum. All this points to the reality that your earnings depend upon a lot of factors, which means that your ability to consume depends upon a lot of factors. And those factors can vary from the cost of living in your area all the way to what occupation you are in, and even including what part of your career you're in, what age group you might be in. Finally, I wanted to show you something from the New York Federal Reserve, their community credit interactive, which gives you some idea about the credit profiles for certain areas of the country. So, for example, if we were to look at credit inclusion data, you can see the percent of adults 18 years and older from the census population with a credit file and a credit score. Let's look more specifically at this in New York. And if we were to look at New York, you can see that the credit economy, the size of the credit economy, varies even for the city based on which borough you're in. So you're living in Richmond, 89% have around a credit file on hand versus 71% in the Bronx. And a more mixed borough would be Manhattan, which is 83.6%. Available credit. So when you're looking at available credit, the percent of the credit economy with a credit card or home equity line of credit. And what you get here is that going from Staten Island is at 82.5% versus the Bronx is 76%, and Manhattan somewhere in the middle, 85.8%. Cool. Credit quality. The percent of the credit economy with a payment history that is current on all credit obligations each of the past 4 quarters. Now, even just looking at the map, you can see that the Bronx is a completely different color from the rest of the map, indicating that 69% of Bronxites are on-time payers for their credit, versus in Staten Island 80% and Manhattan 82%. I point this out because credit matters. Credit tells us whether or not someone is able to expand their consumption opportunities beyond just what income they have coming in currently. And the ability to expand your consumption opportunities beyond that is part of where we can figure out if your limitation is really your disposable income or whether your limitation is really how creditworthy you are, how much you have in assets to borrow against. So we can see this based on like prime rates as well. And you can see that again for the Bronx, the subprime rates are very high as far as the percent of the credit economy with an Equifax score of 720 plus. That would make you prime, and that's only 33% of the Bronx compared to 45% of the Bronx that's under 660. I bring this up to point out that credit quality is also really correlated with geography in the sense that we are a very segregated city and country and even state to some extent. And that means that there are places where poverty concentrates, and the Bronx is one of those places for sure. Let's look at credit stress. Actually, no, I would not like to look at credit stress yet. I want to take a look at the availability of credit based not just on revolving credit, but also on utilization. So the availability of credit based on utilization. Percent of the credit economy with under 30% utilization of their credit cards. Again, you can see that the suburbs around New York are very good in this sense, with like 45% and more of them with under 30%, within under 30% of their credit limits. We go to the Bronx. Only 31% of the Bronx can say that they're under 30% utilization with their credit limits, as opposed to 47%, almost half of Staten Island and over half of Manhattan. Important because if you are high on your credit utilization for the little credit that you do have, it's a bad signal to creditors in the future that you may be a risk. And even more of an issue when disruptions to income happen, because your high utilization of your credit is probably indicative that you have a very low budget line in the form of your disposable income. With low disposable income and a high reliance on credit, you're basically looking at a situation where any disruption to your disposable income streams, any type of emergencies, anything that would immediately be a shock to your ability to make income may jeopardize your ability to make on-time payments. Finally, let's look at the credit economy. Again, looking at people who are not included. So this is looking at the population, percent of adults 18 years or over without a credit file and a credit score. And you can see that it's low for the surrounding suburbs, 3.6 in Nassau, 3.5 in Suffolk. Not so much in many of the more upstate parts of the state. It's important to remember that poverty isn't just concentrated within metropolitan areas, but that there's also poverty that's seeping into more suburban areas of the country. And it's very possible, too, that there are parts of the country that just are credit deserts, and parts of the state that are definitely closer to credit deserts, where the ability to access credit is a little bit limited for various reasons. So looking at these, let's see where the Bronx is at. And with the Bronx, you have almost a third of the Bronx without a credit file or a credit score, compared to 11% of Staten Island. So I'm showing you all of this, and we can look at the credit stress stuff really quickly, actually. If I was to just look at, let's pull up New York. And let's see if we can get counties here. Select the state. Let's do, no, not New Mexico. No, New York. New York. We'll do Bronx County. And let's do, well, we can do Kings County, but why even do that? Let's do Manhattan, which is New York County. And let's also do Richmond County, which is Staten Island. So for those of you who don't know, Richmond County, Staten Island, it has a lot of civil servants on it, a lot of people with a lot of home ownership, a lot of people with steady and secure jobs. Same thing for New York County, although it's a little bit mixed because the lower part of New York County, Manhattan Island, the lower part of that is much higher income than the upper part of Manhattan Island. So there's a mix going on there. And the Bronx County is where there's a lot of the concentrated poverty that exists in the city. So you can see that as measures of credit stress for New York, around 7% of the total credit in the state is considered weak, versus for the Bronx County, that's around 12%. Manhattan reflects the state a little bit closer, and Staten Island is a little bit above Manhattan. But the the percentage of credit that's coming from good credit for the Bronx is also very low, right? And improved is a good sign here that we have around 8% is in the improved range, but 72% are in good credit versus for the whole state it's 84%, and for Manhattan it's 85%, Staten Island's 83%. So yeah, that's just really capping off our look at credit worthiness and how that could interact with consumption patterns. The whole takeaway here is that consumption isn't just in the dimension of disposable income, but also a question of where do you live, how much are you paying for other things that are more necessities like housing, the cost of living, right? It's also a question of how high your income taxes are, but that's kind of a given. But more importantly, or more uniquely, it's also a question of like what type of job do you have access to, or what type of opportunities do you have access to? How old are you? What neighborhoods do you live in? Do you work within the same neighborhood? So yeah, hopefully this video helps you appreciate all of those dimensions a little bit more while reading the chapter.